In 1994, three boys vanished during a school wilderness retreat in the mountains of Washington state, their disappearance dismissed as a tragic hiking accident. But nearly 3 decades later, one man returns to the forest, and what he uncovers buried beneath the soil forces an entire town to confront a truth more disturbing than they ever imagined. Matthew Keene had led many school field trips before. As assistant chaplain of St. Edmund's Parish School in Tacoma, Washington, outdoor education was one of the few times he felt truly useful, when the sermons were swapped for maps and the confession booth replaced by canteens and bug spray. But July 17, 1994 wasn't going to be like any of those trips. The Silver Trail Nature Preserve stretched across 300 square miles of protected forest land in the eastern Cascades. It was remote, wild, and known among the faculty as the Clean Slate, a place where boys could forget their Walkmans and Game Boys and just be kids again. The group that morning consisted of 12 students between ages 10 and 14, 2 senior faculty, and Matthew himself. Among them was Oliver, Matthew's kid brother. 11, skinny, with a mop of dark curls and a tendency to ask questions faster than he could breathe. Oliver hadn't been meant to go. Their mother had been hesitant, but Matthew, full of pride and a touch of guilt for no getting around enough, had promised to keep him close. The group set out at sunrise. The plan was to hike the Crescent Loop, an 8-mile trail circling the glacial lake near the center of the preserve. At around 10:30 a.m., they made camp near Eagles Hollow Ridge, a narrow stretch surrounded by Douglas firs and tall granite formations. The air smelled like pine and sweat. It felt safe, familiar. Then came the moment every educator dreads, the silent count of heads that didn't match. It was around 1:00 p.m. when the group gathered for lunch, and Matthew noticed the absence. 3 were missing: his brother Oliver, a shy boy named Caleb Torres, 13, and one of the junior assistants, a lanky teenager named Garrett Lang, who'd been volunteering at the parish just that summer. Matthew's heart seized. Maybe they went to collect firewood, someone said. Garrett probably took them to look for frogs. The senior teacher, Mrs. Danley, radioed their position to base camp just in case. But as minutes passed and the sun dipped beyond the upper ridge, dread crept in like the rising wind. By 2:00 p.m., the search began in earnest. The other adults split into teams, shouting names, combing the trees and brush. Matthew sprinted along the trail with a flashlight, even though the day was still bright. He wasn't thinking like a teacher anymore, he was thinking like a brother. By dusk, local authorities were called. By midnight, the state search and rescue team had mobilized. Helicopters scoured the canopy. Dogs sniffed out every boot print, every candy wrapper. Volunteers from nearby towns poured in with thermoses of coffee and maps marked in red ink, but no trace came. No footprints, no sleeping bags, no screams, nothing. The woods had swallowed them whole. In interviews, Matthew could barely form words. He described Garrett as quiet, maybe a little intense, but said nothing that would raise alarms. He insisted Oliver wouldn't have wandered. He was too cautious, too clingy. Caleb's parents were inconsolable. Rumors began to swirl. Had Garrett led the boys off trail on purpose? Was there a cave or pitfall nobody knew about? Theories ranged from tragic to sinister, but nothing came of it. Not in the first 24 hours, not in the first week, not in the months that followed. By November, with winter snows descending on the Cascades, the case was declared open with no current leads. St. Edmund's justified canceling all future field trips. The administration offered counseling. Matthew was granted a leave of absence and returned only briefly before transferring to a parish retreat center near Olympia. He was never the same. Years later, when asked by journalists why no formal charges were brought against Garrett or the school, a retired detective said simply, "You can't prosecute a ghost." But Matthew never stopped carrying the weight. He kept the original hike map folded in a Ziploc bag in his desk drawer, along with Oliver's last school photo and a whistle engraved with "Stay Close," a small gift he'd given his brother that morning. Sometimes, in the years that followed, Matthew would drive past the foothills of the Silver Trail and wonder if he should have called lunch earlier, noticed the missing shoes, trusted his instincts when Garrett offered to take the boys for a nature lesson. The what-ifs became a loop, like a rosary worn thin. And deep down, even after 24 years, the thing that haunted him most wasn't the silence. It was the feeling that the forest had kept something. Not just his brother, not just those boys, but a secret that refused to stay buried. In the weeks that followed the disappearance, St. Edmund's School issued no public statements beyond a single typed letter mailed to parents. "We are heartbroken by the tragic events during our recent outdoor excursion. Our thoughts and prayers are with the families. We are cooperating fully with authorities." But behind closed doors, a very different narrative was unfolding. On the third day of the search, before official statements were finalized, a lawyer named Stanley Dorriance arrived at the Keene residence unannounced. He carried a leather briefcase and introduced himself as a liaison on behalf of the diocese, here to support and shield the grieving families. Matthew wasn't home. He was still at the ranger station coordinating with search and rescue, but his mother remembered the visit with eerie clarity. He said things like preemptive legal safety and limiting exposure. He never once used the word found or even hopeful. It was as if he already knew they wouldn't be coming back. The same lawyer visited the Torres family 2 days later, offering to assist in estate planning and proposing a confidential settlement in the form of a scholarship foundation named after Caleb. What puzzled both families was how quickly the school moved. Within 1 week of the disappearance, all marketing materials related to the outdoor leadership program were pulled. Their glossy brochures were shredded. Faculty in the wilderness training unit were reassigned or quietly encouraged to retire early. By mid-August, the school had announced a reevaluation of non-academic activities due to safety concerns. But insiders knew it was a complete dismantling. The program was buried, and not with ceremony. Meanwhile, the investigation floundered. For the first 2 weeks, local law enforcement treated the incident with urgency, but without fresh leads or physical evidence, their momentum began to wane. They collected statements, reviewed trail maps, and interviewed Garrett Lang's foster coordinator, who claimed he'd been a reserved but compliant teen during his brief parish placement. His file, however, was unusually thin, barely more than a single page, half of it handwritten. The more the detectives dug, the stranger things became. Garrett had no known relatives, no prior schooling records beyond a 1-year stint in Spokane, and no social security number that matched his employment paperwork. Still, none of it pointed to foul play conclusively. When the fall semester began, media attention dwindled. The search crews dissolved. Volunteers went back to their jobs. With no bodies, no witnesses, and no clear suspect, the sheriff's office reclassified the case as unresolved wilderness disappearances, citing high-risk terrain and possible misadventure. In December 1994, the lead investigator, a 53-year-old sergeant named Carl Healy, closed the case log with one final note: all plausible theories explored, no new information expected unless remains or witness emerge. Internally, the department moved the files to inactive status. Externally, they called it compassionate closure. To the families, it felt like an open wound being sutured by convenience. Matthew returned to work in early January, though not at St. Edmund's. He accepted a position at a smaller Catholic retreat center in Olympia, hoping a quieter environment might help, but the silence was heavier there. His mother, once devout and daily in Mass, stopped attending church altogether. She could no longer bear to hear sermons about hope or redemption. On the anniversary of the disappearance, she mailed Oliver's baptism certificate back to the diocese with a note that simply read, "You do not deserve to hold this." 6 months after the incident, the Canesis received a check in the mail from an anonymous benefactor via the Archdiocese's finance office, $25,000, 0 cents, labeled as a bereavement contribution. They never cashed it. The Torres family, facing mounting legal bills and a sick grandparent, eventually accepted a similar payment, though not without hesitation. In the background, whispers persisted. Some claimed Garrett had been a troubled teen, recruited through a religious halfway house. Others suggested he was never properly vetted, but the school refused to answer questions, citing pending legal considerations. Journalists who tried to dig deeper were met with polite rejections or outright refusals. A Seattle Post intelligencer columnist who ran a 3-part expose found himself suddenly disinvited from several diocesan events. Matthew, for his part, tried to build a new routine. He volunteered with hospice patients. He taught evening catechism. But every time he saw a boy wearing a hiking backpack, his chest tightened. Every knock on the door after 10 p.m. made his breath hitch. Though he rarely spoke about the trip, he kept map timelines, tracked weather records from that weekend, and compiled interviews with other students. None of it made sense. Garrett had shown no signs of agitation that morning. Caleb had been quiet but content, drawing trees in his sketch pad. Oliver had barely left Matthew's side until lunch. There was no explanation for how or why they vanished so completely. No screams, no prints, no broken branches, just absence. One detail haunted him above all: the last call if he could take the boys ahead to scout for a shaded lunch spot. 15 minutes tops, Garrett had said. They're restless. Matthew had agreed. He trusted Garrett. He trusted the land. He trusted that 15 minutes was not enough time to lose 3 people forever. And then, sometime in late March of 1995, a report arrived quietly at the county records office. Case 94W12 officially closed. No further investigative action warranted unless new physical evidence emerges. The file was stamped, sealed, and shelved under missing persons, non-criminal. No saw that document. He only learned of it through a former ranger who reached out years later, long after the press had moved on and the world had stopped asking. By then, the only people still counting the years were the families. And Matthew. Always Matthew. He kept going back, once every summer, to the ridge near where the last camp had been pitched. He called it the Loop. The ranger staff knew him. Some found it admirable. Others whispered he couldn't let go. But Matthew wasn't looking for closure anymore. He was waiting for something to return. A sound, a memory, a sign, anything. Until one morning, 2 decades later, when the sign did come, though not in the form he expected. The morning it happened, the forest was damp from an early autumn rain. A group of 4 environmental science students from Whitman College were on a weekend research trip, part of a reforestation survey near the southeastern border of Silver Trail Preserve. Their professor had given them a GPS pin for a tree stand last visited in 2007, a place not far from Eagles Hollow Ridge, though none of them knew the history. Around mid-morning, while collecting soil samples near a gnarled fir tree whose roots formed a half-exposed web above the ground, one of the students, Maya Zhao, noticed a faded corner of blue nylon peeking out from under the roots. At first, she thought it was garbage, but when she tugged, the object gave a reluctant pull, and the group quickly realized it was an old backpack, muddy, rotted at the base, but intact enough to unzip. Inside, they found a cracked flashlight, a rusted tin whistle, a half-disintegrated comic book, and, folded into a moldy binder, a St. Edmund's school ID card bearing the name Oliver Kane. None of the students had heard of the name, but Maya took a photo of the card and posted it that night to a regional hiking forum, asking if anyone knew the story behind it. She tagged the post with "Silver Trail Mystery" and moved on. She had no idea the impact that image would cause. The forum wasn't huge, mostly trail enthusiasts, retired rangers, amateur naturalists, but among its members was a retired sheriff's deputy named Dana Worth. He had worked the county for 33 years, and though he wasn't part of the 1994 search team, he remembered the case. A missing boy, his assistant teacher, and a teenage volunteer. The photo shocked him, the name, the school crest, the whistle. It was all too familiar. Dana reached out quietly to a contact in the Archdiocese Registry Office and asked if the Keene family was still listed. Within 48 hours, the image landed in the inbox of a 50-year-old man now living in Seattle. Matthew Keene opened it while alone in his office at the St. Clair Counseling Center, a facility he had helped found in 2009. He hadn't thought of Oliver's ID in years. He had assumed it was lost along with everything else, somewhere deep beneath the roots and silence of that cursed forest. His hands trembled. He zoomed in on the photo, tracing the curve of the faded plastic, the tiny school crest. The card was real. That was Oliver's face, 11 years old, bright-eyed, just before his front tooth came loose that fall. The whistle, he remembered buying it at a sporting goods store on their way out of town. "Stay close," he had said, looping it around his brother's neck. "If we get separated, blow twice." The message on the forum post included the GPS coordinates. It was within 2 miles of the last known search grid. Suddenly, all the sleepless nights, the unanswered prayers, the futile pilgrimages back to the ridge, they no longer felt hollow. Something had surfaced, something that didn't want to stay buried. Matthew closed his laptop slowly and locked the office door. He didn't contact the police. He didn't call the ranger station. He didn't forward the email to anyone. Instead, he printed the map, packed a small overnight bag, and left a vague message with the center's administrator that he'd be attending a silent retreat in Leavenworth. Then he drove east, back toward the Cascades. The highway was quiet that evening. Rain tapped the windshield like memory come knocking. He stayed at a motel just outside Othello, slept in 2-hour stretches, and left at dawn. By 8:00 a.m., he reached the southern access trail to Silver Trail Preserve. The air smelled like pine and damp soil, exactly as it had that July morning in 1994. He parked his car just outside the ranger gate, strapped on his boots, and began hiking alone. He didn't take the main path. Instead, he veered off the official trail just before the first bend, following the overgrown deer tracks and old instincts that had never quite faded. By mid-morning, he reached the coordinates. The fir tree stood like a sentinel, larger now than he remembered, its roots gnarled and hugging the slope of a shallow rise. The ground around it showed signs of recent disturbance, loose soil, scattered pine needles. He circled it slowly, then knelt. The hole where the backpack had been was already collapsing in on itself, the damp earth caving into a shallow bowl. He didn't expect to find more, but he dug anyway, hands shaking, fingers moving through dirt like pages in a book he had once thrown away and now desperately wanted back. Nothing more emerged. No bones, no clothing, just silence and the faint echo of wind through branches. But he stayed. He sat with his back against the tree and listened. He whispered prayers. He tried to remember the sound of Oliver's laugh. By early afternoon he stood and looked downhill. From here he could just barely make out the faint outline of the ridgeline where they had made camp. Something about the angle was off. He walked 30 yards west, then paused. There, through a break in the trees, he saw it, a structure, low and squat, mostly camouflaged by foliage. Not a cabin, not a ranger shack. It looked like an old utility building, roof sagging, one side partially buried by earth. He hadn't remembered this being there. It wasn't on any of the trail maps he had memorized. Curiosity overrode caution. He approached slowly, ducking under branches, stepping over wet roots. The building had a rusted metal door, padlocked shut. The windows were fogged over but not shattered. Something about it felt wrong, not abandoned exactly, but dormant. Matthew pressed his ear to the door. Nothing. He walked around the perimeter. At the back, tucked between 2 fallen logs, was a vent, not a chimney, a ground-level air duct, and from within he could hear the faintest sound. Not voices, not music, just a mechanical hum like old wiring, like something still breathing under the weight of years. He stepped back, breath quickening. He didn't knock. He didn't take photos. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out Oliver's whistle, still looped on a keychain he had never stopped carrying, and blew twice. The sound rang out through the trees, and then, in the pause that followed, something moved inside the building. A shuffle. A scrape. Matthew froze. His heart pounded. He didn't run. He waited. Something was inside. Or someone. Matthew stood motionless for nearly a minute, the air around him thick with anticipation. The sound he'd just heard, a scrape, faint but deliberate, had come from inside the small utility structure buried in the woods. The kind of noise that doesn't happen without intent. He stepped back slowly, scanning the perimeter again, noting how nature had half-claimed the structure. Moss crept up the side of the concrete wall, pine needles blanketed the sagging roof, yet something had stirred within. He circled toward the far end, where the air vent protruded just inches from the earth, camouflaged by years of fallen leaves and undergrowth. Kneeling, he studied the metal grating. It was rusted but intact, and beneath the surface the humming had ceased. The silence now felt deeper than before. He reached into his pack and pulled out a compact flashlight, angled it through the slats, but could see only blackness and a faint shimmer of what looked like condensation. The air that wafted up was stale, faintly metallic. Not freshly ventilated, but not sealed either. Something about the structure nagged at him. It wasn't built for comfort or even for regular use. No signage, no trail markers, no evidence of maintenance. It didn't feel like a ranger station or a storage unit. He circled back to the front, stepped back and studied the low-slung profile. His memory stirred. There had been a forestry research station out here, part of a 1,970 ecological grant to monitor soil erosion. He vaguely remembered hearing about it during early orientation days at St. Edmunds. The program had been shuttered by the late 1980s after budget cuts. No official records were easily accessible, but some of the older rangers had mentioned it back when he was helping with youth wilderness retreats in the early 2000s. This building, this forgotten bunker, must have been part of that. He examined the padlock on the door. It was old, brass-bodied, with flaking edges, but the latch was loose. Years of exposure had corroded the screws anchoring it to the wooden frame. With a firm twist using his multi-tool, Matthew pried the lock free, and the hasp clattered to the ground. The door creaked open, with a groan that made him flinch. Dust and stale air billowed out, making him cough. The smell hit first, maltodue, a leg, scent of antiseptic buried under layers of decay. Inside, the room was no larger than a standard garage, maybe 20 feet long, 15 across. A single cot stood against the far wall, its mattresses colored and sunken. A rusted steel cabinet sat beside it, partially ajar. Shelves lined the right side, holding cracked plastic containers, some marked with faded red crosses, medical supplies. Empty cans of beans and peaches were stacked in a corner. A broken portable radio lay face down on the floor, next to a crumpled jacket too small for an adult. Matthew stepped in, cautious. Every surface was coated in grime. It didn't feel like someone had lived here recently, but it hadn't been completely abandoned either. He moved toward the cot and noticed the small, hard impressions in the dust, shapes where objects had rested until recently. He opened the cabinet. Most of it was empty, but tucked at the bottom was an old tin first aid box. Its contents were gone except for a cracked thermometer and a single rubber band. On the inside of the lid, scratched into the metal, were letters. At first he thought it was random damage, but when he angled his flashlight just right, 3 names became visible, etched unevenly as if by a knife or sharp rock. His breath caught. The letters were rough, scuffed over by time, but unmistakable. Not printed by the same hand, different angles, different pressure. 3 names, 3 people, his brothers among them. Matthew stumbled back and leaned against the opposite wall, knees weak. His pulse roared in his ears. These names, scratched here inside a forgotten forestry building, meant they had been here, not briefly, not passing through, long enough to leave a mark, but when? How? He looked around more intently now. The floor had worn tracks, especially near the shelves and cabinet. In the corner, near the cot, there were scratch marks on the concrete, shallow grooves like something had been dragged repeatedly. The windows were too high for anyone under 6 feet to reach easily, and they were covered from the inside with nailed-up plywood. Light barely made it through the cracks. This wasn't a shelter, it was a cell. Near the cot, he noticed a piece of torn paper curled from moisture. He picked it up gently. It was from a school workbook, lines faint but visible. In pencil, written in a child's jagged hand, were 3 words: "Let us out." Beneath it, smeared into near illegibility, was what might have been a date, August '94. He closed his eyes. August, a month after the disappearances. He sat for nearly an hour inside that building, trying to piece it together. The names, the signs of habitation, the vent. Someone had been here. Had they escaped? Been moved? Had someone else found this place and covered it up? His thoughts spiraled. If Garrett had brought the boys here, and he was starting to believe that now, then this was no accident. No one got lost and stumbled into an abandoned forestry building with boarded windows and emergency rations. Someone had planned this. Someone had watched, prepared, stocked the place, and whoever had etched those names hadn't just been a visitor. They had lived, and possibly died, within these 4 walls. A dull sound outside startled him, something like a branch snapping underfoot. He carried the flashlight and waited, heart hammering. Another sound followed, closer, lower, like fabric scraping bark. Someone was outside. Matthew moved toward the door slowly, back pressed to the wall. He waited, barely breathing. The footsteps faded, but the fear stayed coiled and tight. He waited 10 more minutes, then stepped out carefully. The forest was still. The shadows had shifted, but no one was visible. Still, he knew someone had been there, watching, or returning. And suddenly, he realized he wasn't alone in remembering this place. Matthew didn't sleep that night. After leaving the abandoned building, he hiked 2 miles back to his vehicle without turning on his headlights. Every sound in the forest now felt deliberate. When he finally reached the motel near Othello, he locked the door, pulled the curtains, and laid out the items he had collected on the bed. The torn workbook page, the photo of the scratched names inside the cabinet, a sketch he made of the vent and the structure's dimensions. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself. Not anymore. Something about the way the footsteps had retreated into the woods confirmed that he had crossed into someone else's memory, maybe even someone else's guilt. At sunrise, he drove to the nearest sheriff's office and asked to speak with someone familiar with the 1994 Silver Trail investigation. Flipped confused, no one on current staff was even out of high school when the case happened, but after a few calls, they gave him the number of a retired detective, Paul Merrick, who had led the early phases of the missing persons report before being rotated to another department. Matthew called, expecting a voicemail. Instead, Merrick answered on the second ring. "Kane," he said after a beat. "I was wondering how long it would take." The voice was slower now, older, but the name had clearly stuck. Matthew explained what he found, trying to keep his tone measured, but Merrick stopped him halfway. "I believe you," the man said, sighing audibly. "We always knew the case didn't add up. What we didn't have was permission to keep pushing." Matthew paused. "Permission from who?" Merrick hesitated, then said, "St. Edmunds had a legal team breathing down our necks within days. They wanted to frame it as a tragic accident. 3 actuaries, lost to nature, no foul play, no suspect, no liability. We were told to stop treating it like a crime scene and start treating it like a wilderness misadventure. We were told it came from the diocese level, direct." Matthew's stomach tightened. "You're saying the school blocked the investigation?" "Not blocked," Merrick said slowly, "but they discouraged ambition. We got pressure to close it fast. Budget concerns, media optics, and the paperwork? The copy of the hike plan. We didn't even get the original." That struck Matthew hard. The hike plan. He remembered Garrett handing him a sheet that morning, a copy of the route and schedule they were meant to follow. It had shown a simple crescent loop, well within ranger-tracked areas. But something had nagged at Matthew back then. Garrett had taken them east instead of northwest, claiming the first leg of the trail was washed out. It hadn't felt right at the time, but he had trusted the volunteers' familiarity. Now, decades later, the deviation seemed almost choreographed. Merrick told him to come by his home the next day. He had kept a few private files, old maps, personal notes. "I always thought we missed something," he admitted, "but no one wanted to hear it. Now, I think it's time something finally does." Merrick drove 3 hours to Merrick's modest home in Chellan, where the former detective pulled out a box labeled Keene Case. Inside were photocopies of ranger logs, weather records, and something else. An alternate trail diagram. "This," Merrick said, pointing to a hand-drawn path marked in red, "was the route the search teams used based on what the school gave us. But 3 weeks after, one of the volunteer rangers found something odd." He handed Matthew a second map, recovered from a campsite near Eagles Hollow. On the back was a list of coordinates, annotated in official evidence. Merrick said, "But I always believed it showed the real path Garrett took them on. It veers off sharply after mile 2, straight toward the southeast quadrant, the least patrolled section of the preserve." "Where you found the backpack?" Matthew studied the 2 maps side by side. The planned route had them looping safely back toward the lodge by mid-afternoon. The alternate one, now clearly Garrett's, led them miles off course, through a corridor known for its dense underbrush and old logging debris. "So he mislaid us from the start," Matthew said, the words tasting bitter. "He planned this?" Merrick nodded. "It was deliberate. I just couldn't prove it. No bodies, no weapon, no confession." "And Garrett Lang, He vanished like smoke. No school records beyond a year, no prints in the system. It was like someone created a file just long enough to get him in, then pulled the plug. I don't think they were protecting him. I think they were protecting themselves. If it came out that a parish-vetted volunteer had orchestrated a disappearances, it would have blown a hole through their whole vetting system. Worse, if he wasn't properly screened, if he was placed by someone as a favor, that's liability they couldn't afford. So they buried it. Matthew asked if anything could be reopened now. Merrick shook his head. Not unless you've got new evidence, physical, not anecdotal. Something real. Something you can put in front of a judge. Until then, it's all shadows. But shadows were something Matthew knew how to chase. That night he returned home, laid out both maps again, and began plotting the GPS coordinates of the alternate path there was. A cluster that aligned with the old forestry station, then another, deeper east, unexplored, unmarked, a place not on any official trail. And one more detail caught his eye, one that made the blood drain from his face. On the edge of Garrett's hand-drawn map, scrawled almost like an afterthought, were two words in the same cursive. He traced the line from the word to coordinates. It pointed beyond the old structure, into a deeper section of the wood. Unpatrolled, unnamed, but not, it seemed, unused. 2 weeks after his visit to Detective Merrick, Matthew Keene stood just outside the police perimeter in Silver Trail Preserve, arms crossed, heart pounding. The air was sharp with pine and tension. Yellow tape cordoned off the site near the collapsed forestry shed, and 3 unmarked county vehicles sat parked under the shadows of the tall firs. The GPS coordinates from the alternate trail map had been submitted to the Sheriff's Department in Chelan County, along with Matthew's statement and photographic evidence. Merrick had accompanied him when he handed over the documents in person. A sympathetic young prosecutor reviewed their findings and, within days, approved a limited search warrant for the area surrounding the old structure. The authorization was narrow, but sufficient. What happened next wasn't fast. It was methodical. A forensic team arrived with ground-penetrating radar and spent 2 full days scanning the terrain. On the 3rd morning, one of the technicians marked a section of uneven earth near the rear of the building. The soil there had compacted in a way that suggested prior disturbance and reburial. At first glance, it was nothing more than a moss-covered patch surrounded by saplings and weathered treefall, but beneath it, something waited. By noon, the team had begun excavation. A backhoe operated under delicate guidance, peeling away layers of dirt, inch by inch. Within hours, the steel edge of a man-made surface emerged, concrete, not stone, not natural. The structure beneath the earth was small, no larger than a walk-in closet, mechanical and flush to the ground. The concrete had cracked in places, likely from shifting earth over the years, but the seal remained mostly intact. The sheriff on site, a woman named Laura Garvin, made the decision to break through the slab carefully. Saws and hand tools were brought in to preserve any evidence. It took until the following day to finish clearing. When they finally broke the top layer, the smell hit first. Not rot, it had been too long for that, but something deeper, older, like dust and rust and enclosed despair. The chamber beneath was shallow, perhaps 6 feet wide, 5 deep. No door, no ladder, just a rectangular pit, walls lined with poured concrete and no apparent air system. Inside lay the remains of 2 young boys. They were arranged side by side on what had once been thin bedrolls. Clothing remnants clung to their bones, and several small objects, buttons, a shoelace, the frame of a pair of broken glasses, were scattered across the floor. There were no signs of trauma, no blood, no blunt force markings, but the space had no ventilation, no source of water. It was a tomb. Matthew wasn't allowed to approach the pit directly, but he could see the reactions on the officers' faces. Even the forensic techs, usually composed, had stepped back in silence. Over the next 48 hours, the site was processed thoroughly. The remains were removed with reverence and transported to the state coroner's office for analysis. Matthew returned to Seattle, but didn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that concrete rectangle in the ground, saw the shallow shadows where lives had ended beneath feet of silence. A week later, Sheriff Garvin called him personally. "Matthew," she said, "I need to prepare you. The lab confirmed the identity through dental records." They are Oliver Keene and Caleb Torres." He didn't respond right away. His grip on the phone tightened, but his voice failed him. "Also have preliminary findings," she continued. "There's no sign of external injury. Cause of death is consistent with asphyxiation due to oxygen deprivation. There were high traces of CO2 buildup in the residual air pockets. Starvation was also a contributing factor. The coroner estimates time of death to be within 10 to 12 days of the disappearance." Matthew sat in the dark of his apartment, the words sinking in. They hadn't died instantly. They had survived for days, possibly over a week, long enough to hope, long enough to pray, long enough for someone to find them if anyone had known where to look. "There was no way in or out?" he asked finally. "Just sealed in?" "That's correct," Garvin said. "No hatch, no door. The roof was poured shut from above after they were inside. It was deliberate, it was careful, and it was evil." Matthew pressed his palm to his mouth, trying to steady his breathing. "We also found something else," Garvin added after a pause. "There were scratches on the inside walls, fingernail marks mostly, and 2 phrases etched into the concrete, one above each bedroll." "What did they say?" "Above Oliver it read, 'He promised he'd come back.'" Matthew leaned forward, head in his hands. For years he had imagined scenarios, accidents, wild animals, wrong turns, but never this. Never the slow descent into suffocation, sealed in concrete and silence, while search parties walked unknowingly above. Garvin continued. "There was also evidence someone had revisited the site after the burial. The moss growth was interrupted. A footprint, possibly recent. We're still analyzing." Matthew swallowed hard. "Is there any sign of Garrett Lang?" "We've reopened the missing persons file under a new designation, person of interest in a homicide case. But so far, no hits. We'll know exactly what to charge him with." Matthew didn't reply. He stared out his window at the street below, where life moved forward, unaware. He thought of the concrete, the airless dark, the fact that someone at some point had stood above that pit and chosen to seal it forever. He opened his drawer and removed the second map, the one with dry shelter scrawled in the corner. The coordinates extended beyond the current site, another location or possibility. If Garrett had built one pit, what else had he buried? 2 days after the coroner's call, Matthew Kane sat across from Sheriff Garvin in a quiet office within the Chelan County Sheriff's Department, his eyes fixed on a manila folder she slid toward him. "This hasn't been released to the press," she said, "and we're sharing it with you because of your direct connection. But I need you to prepare yourself." Matthew nodded silently. He opened the folder and found a summary of the full forensic analysis. His hands didn't shake. They felt too cold for that. He read slowly. "Time of death estimates both victims likely expired between 5 to 7 days following date of disappearance. Primary cause, asphyxiation due to carbon dioxide accumulation in a sealed environment. Secondary complications, dehydration, caloric deficiency, psychological duress." He paused on that last phrase, psychological duress, he imagining what it must have meant inside that buried concrete box. "She was believed," Garvin continued softly, "that both boys were conscious for at least several days, possibly more. It's clear they attempted to call for help. There's something else you need to see." She opened a second folder and removed a clear evidence bag containing a covered desk. Suddenly, the bag slid open. Understanding Matthew's second folded paper, their edges stained but legible. She handed Matthew the first photocopy. It was a torn sheet of lined notebook paper, words scrawled in blocky handwriting. "Please find us, we are stuck underground. Air is bad, no food. He said he would let us out." Another note followed, this time more rushed, the pencil pressure uneven. "We can hear footsteps above, but no one answers. We are locked in from the outside." There was no name signed, but the handwriting suggested a child. The repetition of "locked from the outside" appeared in every note. The last one, written on what appeared to be the inside of a candy wrapper, simply read, "He lied." Matthew leaned back slowly, unable to tear his eyes away. "They were still alive when the search teams were here," he whispered. Garvin nodded grimly. "That's the hardest part. The search grid came within 400 yards of this location on day 3. If someone had just stepped off the trail a little farther, if someone had heard anything, it might have made the difference." Matthew placed the note down with reverence. The horror was no longer abstract. It was ink on paper, a timeline etched in desperation. "Have you confirmed who wrote them?" he asked. "Handwriting specialists are analyzing," Carol said, "but we believe one note was likely Oliver's and another, possibly Caleb's. The third, written on the wrapper, was more jagged, could have been either in their final hours." He stared at the paper again, the phrase "locked from the outside" echoing louder each time. The killer had stood there, concrete ready, victims trapped, and had made a choice to seal them in alive. There was no panic, no accident. This was premeditation of the cruelest kind. "We also found small scratch marks along the base of the door slab," Garvin added. "Not just fingernails, scrapings with a metal object, maybe that whistle you mentioned. The pattern suggests they knew someone was nearby and tried to make noise." Matthew swallowed hard. He remembered the search team, the sound of dogs barking, the thump of helicopter blades overhead. And underground, beneath concrete and roots, 2 children waited. Breathing, hoping, dying. He clenched his fists, pain rising in his chest. Whoever did this was close. Too close to miss. Garvin nodded. "It gets worse. The tin box wasn't rusted all the way through, meaning it had been placed with them intentionally, as if they were allowed to write, to believe there was a chance. That kind of manipulation isn't impulsive. It's calculated." Matthew looked up. "You're describing someone who wanted them to suffer slowly, who needed control." "Yes," Garvin said. "Which brings us back to Garrett Lang." She slid another paper across the desk. It was a printout of an old intake form, Garrett's parish volunteer file from St. Edmunds, dated April 1994. The form was incomplete. No social security number, no verified emergency contact, no previous references. A handwritten note in the margin read, "Accepted by Diocesan's Youth Placement Program, Fast Track, approved by Frank and whose father are." "We're working on that," Garvin said. "The original church records were hard to access, but we've subpoenaed them. What matters is this: someone vouched for Garrett without following standard procedure. Someone pushed him through." Matthew scanned the note again, his mind turning, and what if that someone knew Garrett wasn't who he claimed to be? Garvin tilted her head. "You think this goes beyond Garrett?" "I think Garrett was the tool," Matthew replied quietly, "but someone else handed him the blueprints." He paused, then added, "There's still one person unaccounted for, one name not on the autopsy list." Garvin met his eyes. "Garrett." "No," Matthew said. "The third name carved into the cabinet wall inside the shed. Garrett, Oliver, Caleb. If Garrett did this alone, why include his own name? Why mark himself with them?" Garrett went still. "Unless," Matthew continued, voice steady, "he wasn't alone down there either. And if Garrett had never left the forest, if he had been down there all this time, trapped in his own hell, or hidden in someone else's time, then maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't over yet." Sheriff Garvin's words echoed in Matthew's head long after he'd left the office. Garrett Lang's name, scratched next to Oliver and Caleb's on the metal cabinet wall, haunted him not only for what it implied, but because of what was missing. Garrett had never been found. Not a single trace, not a body, no footprints, no conclusive evidence of his fate. It had always been assumed that Garrett, 19 and new to the volunteer program, had either perished alongside the 2 boys or fled into the wilderness. But now that assumption felt dangerously convenient. Over the next week, Garvin's team reopened every archival record tied to Garrett's name, digging into diocesan records, school forms, and state volunteer clearances. The trail they uncovered was not just thin, it was manufactured. Garrett Lang had no birth certificate in Washington, no verified school enrollment past a single year at a community college under a provisional ID. His parish assignment paperwork had been submitted by someone listed only as R. Thorne, a name that appeared nowhere else in the diocesan's employee database. His volunteer application lacked a signature from any official school administrator, and perhaps most unsettling of all, his emergency contact form was blank. "This is not how you place a team in a Catholic youth program," Garvin muttered, tapping the file on her desk. He was either planted deliberately or slipped through a system too easy to have warm bodies leading hikes. Matthew sat beside her, silent but rigid. He recalled how, during the hike, Garrett had seemed overly prepared. His gear was military grade, not standard issue. He carried no phone, no ID, claimed he'd left them at base camp, and yet, at the time, no one questioned it. He was polite, helpful, even warm with the boys. But now, those memories shimmered with revision. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a retired forensic analyst named Greg Farnell, who had kept copies of old flagged records from hospitals involved in suspicious ID cases. After hearing about the reopened case on a private law enforcement bulletin, Farnell contacted Garvin's team with something unusual. In 2001, a man had been admitted to a small hospital in Spokane under the name Daniel Reese. He had sustained minor injuries from what was described as a camping accident, a fall, some lacerations, dehydration. He refused to list next of kin. No insurance. Paid cash, discharged himself after 36 hours, and vanished. The hospital had archived a blurry security cam still of the patient. Facial recognition software didn't exist at the time, but Farnell had recently updated his system using newer AI-assisted scans. On a whim, he ran the image through the database, now tagged with Garrett Lang. The match came back at 89.7%. It was the first possible sighting in over 2 decades. Garvin requested full access to the original footage. The video showed a lean young man in his mid-20s, pale, with sunken cheeks and shoulder-length hair. He kept his face down but occasionally looked up, just enough to catch his bone structure, his eyes, the tilt of his jaw. The resemblance to Garrett was striking. Farnell's software, refined over years of cold case comparisons, estimated a 92% match when factoring in age progression and environmental impact on facial features. Matthew stared at the footage on Garvin's laptop. "That's him," he said without hesitation. "I remember the way he used. Daniel Reese was also fake," Garvin said. "Checked. No DMV record, no voter registration, no social trace before or after that hospital stay. Whoever he was, he knew how to stay hidden." The possibility that Garrett had not only survived but had moved freely among the public, unseen and unpunished, opened a floodgate of questions. Had he acted alone? Had someone helped him disappear? And why would he resurface briefly in 2001 only to vanish again? Garvin's team began combing through surrounding shelters, rural churches, seasonal employment records, anywhere a young man with no ID might blend in. Meanwhile, Matthew requested to view Garrett's full volunteer intake file again. He combed through every page, every line. Then something stood out, a field marked previous experience with youth ministries and the word A/A written in black letters, not in Garrett's handwriting. It matched a different ink tone, a different pen, and beneath it, barely visible under lamplight, was the faint indentation of a second name, written and erased: Jonas. Matthew blinked. Jonas, not Garrett. Or was that the original name, an alias buried and rewritten? He called Merrick, who remembered the detail from long ago. "We flagged it back then," the old detective said. "Thought it might have been a mistake. Paperwork was sloppy. No one wanted to question the church too hard." Now Matthew wasn't so sure. If Garrett Jonas had been placed there under false pretenses, then someone in authority had not only known but had orchestrated it. He wondered how far up that rot went. As he stared again at the paused hospital footage, Matthew felt something shift in his gut. Garrett hadn't died. He hadn't been a victim. He had walked away, and if he had resurfaced once, it meant he was still out there. The closer they got to the truth, the more the layers peeled back into something far darker than Matthew or Garvin had anticipated. After the facial match with the hospital footage, the investigation team intensified background checks, expanding beyond public records and into old diocesan archives that hadn't been touched in decades. One thread finally led to a long-defuncted Catholic children's facility known as St. Florian's Shelter, located in rural Idaho. Officially, it had closed in 1993 due to funding shortages, but internal memos obtained from the Archdiocese suggested another reason: repeated reports of staff abuse, unregulated discipline practices, and at least 3 minors sustaining injuries under suspicious circumstances. Garrett Lang, or rather the boy who became Garrett Lang, had been one of the long-term residences. He'd arrived in 1985 under state care, placed there after his mother, a transient addict, abandoned him in Spokane. There were no adoption records, no documented foster placements, just intake forms, a few incident reports, and then silence. until 1992. That year, the name appeared again in a disciplinary file. At 17, Garrett had assaulted another boy during morning prayers, allegedly using a sharpened wooden cross. The other child survived but required stitches. The internal report marked the event as religiously motivated aggression and noted Garrett's increasing pattern of fixation on penance and divine fear. Rather than refer him to juvenile authorities, the shelter quietly expelled him under the cover of a psychiatric recommendation. The archdiocese relocated him to a different facility, but no subsequent housing assignment was ever confirmed. The trail disappeared until he resurfaced in 1994 as a freshly assigned youth volunteer at St. Edmund's Outdoor Leadership Program. Garvin stared at the files with a mixture of disbelief and anger. They placed him back with children. After this? Matthew didn't respond immediately. He was reading a second document, one that Garvin's team had recovered from an encrypted storage drive turned over by a former assistant to the late Bishop Kincaid, who had overseen St. Edmund's programming in the early 90s. Among the files was a scanned letter, handwritten, addressed simply to Your Grace. Dated March 1994, it read, "Regarding the Spring Wilderness Group, I believe young Garrett is an ideal fit for supervision. His past is unorthodox, yes, but his understanding of discipline and his zeal for obedience may be just what these children need. I've spoken with him at length. His views are stern but grounded in faith. Some of the boys this year have proven difficult in class, arrogant, dismissive of spiritual instruction. Perhaps a week under Garrett's guidance will bring them humility. Let the wild temper them." It was signed, plus M.R. Thorne, Bishop Thorne. A name previously dismissed as a clerical footnote now loomed large. Matthew felt a chill. They knew. They not only knew, they selected him for it. Further digging unearthed an even more disturbing artifact. In Garrett's personal effects, items recovered from the old forestry shack now preserved in evidence, was a tattered composition notebook. Most of the pages were blank or weather-damaged, but several had survived. Inside were dated entries scrawled in erratic, obsessive handwriting. One, written the night before the disappearance, read, "They mock the forest, they sing while the word lies still. They do not listen, but they will. They will see what the silence teaches. The boy with the whistle laughs when he should kneel. The other doubts when he should pray. I do not wish to harm them, but how else do they learn? A trial by silence, a tomb of reflection. They will emerge stronger if God wills it." Matthew pushed the notebook away, stomach twisting. This wasn't a breakdown, he said. This was doctrine, his own twisted version of it. Garvin was quiet for a long moment. We interviewed one of the retired staff from St. Florian's. She remembered Garrett, said he was always calm until scripture was mentioned. Then he'd shake. Not from fear, from something else, like anticipation. He used to tell other boys they were soft, that God hated softness. The narrative was no longer murky. Garrett had been placed in a system that failed him early, had been radicalized in isolation, then handed authority over children by an institution desperate for obedience. And somewhere in that process, he'd built his own theology, one rooted in fear, control, punishment masquerading as purification. Matthew thought of Oliver, of Caleb, of their final days in the pit. Not random, not accidental, a ritual. Did Bishop Thorne ever face consequences? Garvey shook her head. He passed in 2006. No public investigations, no complaints ever officially filed. But we're re-examining everything now. All placements, all disciplinary bypasses. Someone had to sign off on hiding Garrett's past. As she spoke, an alert chimed on her laptop. She opened it, scanned the message, and looked up with sharp urgency. "We have something. A hit on the name Daniel Reese, used again in a clinic in Oregon last month." Matthew's eyes narrowed. "He's still moving," Garrett said. "And if that's true, he knows we're closing in. And for the first time in decades, the predator might finally be within reach." In October 2022, nearly 3 decades after the disappearance of Oliver Keene and Caleb Torres, U.S. Marshals confirmed the apprehension of Garrett Lang, also known by at least 3 aliases, including Daniel Reese, at a roadside checkpoint just outside Merida, Mexico. He had been living under a false identity, working part-time as a groundskeeper at a rural retreat center operated by an independent religious collective. The arrest followed a months-long joint investigation between U.S. federal agents and Mexican authorities, triggered by the Oregon Clinic report and a federal warrant issued after a grand jury reviewed the forensic and testimonial evidence gathered by Sheriff Garvin's office. When they brought Garrett into custody, he did not resist. According to the agents present, he simply asked, "Did they finally dig it up?" During interrogation, Garrett initially refused to speak. But as the evidence mounted, including handwriting samples, recovered personal notes, and the documented connection to Bishop Thorne, he offered a statement that stunned everyone in the room. He confessed. He described the day of the hike in precise detail, how he had prepared the forestry shed in advance as a base, and how the burial pit had been constructed 2 months earlier with supplies stolen from a defunct ranger station. When asked why, he claimed he wanted to show them the truth of faith through silence and fear. But more chilling than that was his recounting of the moment he chose to leave. "They resisted," he said. "They began shouting, accusing me of lying. Caleb tried to run. Oliver refused to pray. I told them this was a test, but they mocked it. It was never meant to go that far. I needed time to think. I left to clear my head." When pressed further, he admitted that by the time he returned, he found the site surrounded by search crews. "I panicked," he said. "I ran." He then spent 2 nights in the forest before hitching a ride out of state, eventually making his way south with forged papers provided, he claimed, by a friend of the bishop. His path through Arizona, New Mexico, and into Mexico was marked by years of hiding, manual labor, and intermittent stays in monastic hostels under false names. At no point did he attempt to contact authorities, the boys' families, or his former church. When news of the arrest reached Matthew Keene, he was sitting in the chapel of the retreat center where he had worked for the last decade. He read the headline twice before he could believe it. "Fugitive in 1994 Catholic Camp Disappearance Captured After 28 Years." He didn't speak. He simply closed his eyes and placed both hands over his chest, as if steadying a heartbeat that had been waiting too long. The next morning he submitted his resignation. The statement he gave was simple, direct, and final. "I no longer feel worthy to guide others while I still carry the weight of those I could not protect." But stepping down was only the first step. Matthew volunteered to testify at Garrett's trial, not as an expert or observer, but as a witness to the decisions that led up to that fateful day. He provided a full account of the hike, the deviation from the planned route, Garrett's behavior, the delay in raising the alarm, and the years of unanswered questions that followed. His testimony was key in reinforcing the premeditated nature of the crime. Prosecutors presented the letters, maps, and notes that had been uncovered. Garrett's own journal, recovered from his Mexico residence, contained entries echoing his original motives, a belief that fear was a necessary component of divine revelation. The court did not take long to convict. Garrett Lang was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the unlawful confinement and second-degree murder of Oliver Keene and Caleb Torres. Before the sentencing, each family was given the opportunity to make a statement. Matthew requested to deliver his in writing. What he read shook the courtroom into silence. "To the families of Oliver and Caleb," he began, voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I was the second adult on that hike. I was the one responsible for counting heads, for checking the map, for challenging any decision that deviated from protocol. But I failed to act when the trail bent wrong. I doubted my instinct. I stayed quiet when I should have spoken." He paused, then continued, "On that morning in July 1994, I walked 1 kilometer in the wrong direction. That is all it took. 1 kilometer off, and I lost 2 lives. I have spent every year since then trying to walk that distance back, through prayer, through service, through silence. But nothing I do can return your sons to you. Nothing I say can erase the pain. Still, I am here. I offer what I have left, my truth, my sorrow, and my witness to what happened." In the weeks following the trial, Matthew retreated from public life. He moved to a small coastal town in Oregon, where he began volunteering anonymously at a crisis center for at-risk youth. He never gave interviews, never sought recognition. But each Sunday, without fail, he lit 2 candles in the back row of the local parish. For Oliver, for Caleb. The site of the old forestry building was officially reclassified as a memorial zone. A plaque now rests near the tree line, simple and unadorned. It reads, "In memory of 2 boys who walked into the woods in search of wonder and were met with silence. May their light endure where their voices could not." And beneath it, etched by Matthew himself, are the final words from his letter. "I went 1 kilometer off that day, and it took a lifetime to find my way back." If this story moved you, consider subscribing to the channel for more true narrative mystery. What part of this case struck you the most? Do you think justice was truly served? Let us know your thoughts in the comments and tell us where in the world you're watching from.